David Carter thought he had outrun his past. He had buried his faith beneath years of resentment, turning his back on the God he once trusted. But no matter how far he strayed, the ache of loss never faded. Then, on a cold, quiet night, something happened. A sound, soft, familiar, echoed through the darkness. A hymn he hadn't heard in years drifted from the old church he swore he'd never enter again. His chest tightened. His feet hesitated. Why now? Why here? The melody carried a truth he wasn't ready to face, yet it pulled at the deepest part of him. Would he keep running? Or was this the moment God had been leading him to all along? Before we continue with the story, take a moment to subscribe. Grab a coffee or your favorite drink as we journey into the depths of God's love, where faith is tested, prayers are answered in unexpected ways, and miracles unfold when we least expect them. Stay with us, because this story will reveal just how powerful faith can be. David Carter leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The glow of the setting sun cast long shadows over the gleaming desk, but the warmth did little to thaw the cold weight in his chest. He had spent years building this empire. Wealth, influence, and power were his for the taking, yet none of it filled the silent void gnawing at him. His phone buzzed, and with a tired sigh, he answered. "Carter," he said sharply. The voice on the other end hesitated before delivering the blow. The investment deal he had poured months into had collapsed. Millions lost. Reputation at Mayo. Stake. David ran a hand through his dark hair, his jaw tightening. "Fix it," he barked before ending the call. But even as he stared at the black screen, he knew this was a battle already lost. He should have felt anger, frustration, anything. But all he felt was a hollow, numbing emptiness. He loosened his tie, reaching for the glass of bourbon he kept on his desk. But the moment he lifted it, his hand faltered. He frowned, setting it down with a thud. His mind drifted, unbidden, to a time when he had leaned on prayer instead of alcohol, when faith had been his anchor. That was another life, another man, one who had been foolish enough to believe in a God who let his sister die. A chime from his laptop snapped him from the thought. He clicked absent-mindedly on a news article, his breath catching as he read the headline, "Declining Faith, Small-Town Church Faces Permanent Closure." The accompanying image sent a shock through his system, his childhood church, the one where he had once knelt as a boy, seeking solace in prayer. Now, its doors were shut, its walls crumbling under neglect. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as a foreign emotion stirred within him. Nostalgia? Regret? He scoffed, shaking. His head. He had buried that part of himself long ago. Yet, as he closed his laptop, a strange unease settled over him, a whisper in his heart he tried to ignore. "You're searching for something, David, but you already had it." David drove through the dimly lit streets of his childhood town, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The gas station, the old library, the tiny diner on Main Street, all unchanged, yet they felt foreign. The memories pressed in like unwelcome guests, each one whispering reminders of a faith he had long abandoned. He pulled up to the church, its once white walls now dull with age, the wooden doors slightly ajar as if waiting for him. A deep breath did nothing to steady the turmoil inside him. Stepping out of the car, he hesitated before pushing the doors open. Dust swirled in the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The wooden pews stood in solemn silence, and at the front, the cross still hung above the altar, untouched by time. His chest tightened. It had been years since he last stood here. Years since he had clenched his fists in defiance at the very God he had once worshipped. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the aisle, stopping where he and Emily used to sit. His fingers traced the carvings in the wood, his own handiwork from when he was just a restless boy sitting through Sunday sermons. "David?" A voice, aged but familiar, broke through the quiet. He turned sharply to see Pastor James standing near the pulpit, his wrinkled face illuminated by the faint glow of candlelight. The old man studied him with knowing eyes, as if seeing through the carefully built walls David had constructed around his heart. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here," James said, his voice gentle but firm. David swallowed hard, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Didn't think I'd ever come back," he admitted. The pastor nodded slowly, stepping forward. "But God has a way of calling us home, even when we don't want to listen." David scoffed, shaking his head. If God really cared, he wouldn't have taken her. His voice cracked, the rawness of his pain slipping through. James sighed, eyes filled with understanding. "You're carrying a heavy burden, son, but running from God doesn't make it any lighter." David turned away, his jaw clenched. The ache in his chest was suffocating, the weight of grief and anger unbearable. He hadn't come for a sermon. He had come because something deep inside him, something he had tried to silence for years, had stirred at the stranger's words in the city. "You're searching for what you already had." But what did that even mean? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustling of leaves outside. James didn't push. He simply waited. And for the first time in years, David wasn't sure if he wanted to keep running. David sat on the edge of a pew, his elbows on his knees, staring at the pulpit where Pastor James stood silently. The air inside the church felt heavier now, as if his very presence disturbed its peace. "I'm not looking for answers," David muttered. "I just came back to clear my head." Pastor James nodded, his expression calm. "That's how it starts, you know. You step back into his house, thinking it's just for a moment. But God doesn't waste moments, David." David let out a bitter chuckle. "That's a nice sentiment, Pastor. But let's be real. Walked away from all of this for a reason." James took a seat across from him. "And yet here you are." David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't have a choice," he admitted. "Something about this place just—" He hesitated, his mind flashing back to the stranger's words in the city. "You're searching for what you already had." "You lost something here," James said gently. "Not just your sister, but something else. Something deeper." David's throat tightened. "I lost myself," he whispered. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the sound oddly soothing. Pastor James folded his hands. "God isn't afraid of your anger, David. He isn't scared of your questions or your grief. He's been waiting for you, even through the silence." David clenched his fists. "I prayed for Emily, Pastor. I begged God to save her, and he didn't." His voice cracked with the weight of his pain. "So tell me, why should I come back to a God who let her die?" James sighed deeply. "I won't give you a neat answer that ties everything up in a bow, because grief isn't that simple. But I will tell you this. Faith isn't about never experiencing pain. It's about knowing you're not alone in it." David looked away, his heart warring within him. He had spent years believing he was alone, that God had turned his back on him. But something about the pastor's words struck a chord, rattling the walls David had built around himself. "I don't know if I can believe again," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. James gave him a knowing look. "Then start with this. God still believes in you." David swallowed hard. The weight in his chest didn't disappear, but for the first time in a long time, something shifted. A crack in the walls, a whisper of something he wasn't ready to name. Hope. And it terrified him. David left the church before dawn, the conversation with Pastor James still echoing in his mind. The walk back to his childhood home felt surreal, each step pulling him deeper into a past he had spent years trying to escape. The old Carter house stood at the end of the dirt road, its once white paint now faded and chipped. It had been years since he'd last set foot inside, yet nothing had changed. The front porch still creaked under his weight, the wind still whispered through the cracks in the windows, and the hollow ache in his chest remained as strong as ever. He hesitated before opening the door. The scent of dust and aged wood greeted him, mingling with something else, something faint, yet unmistakable. Lavender, Emily's favorite. His breath caught as memories surfaced unbidden. Late nights spent reading Bible stories with her soft laughter filling the air, the way she always believed, always trusted, that God had a purpose. She was the strong one, he thought bitterly, not me. David stepped into the living room, his eyes drawn to the fireplace mantel. His mother had once filled it with framed pictures, but only one remained. A photo of Emily, smiling despite the frailness in her eyes. The sight of it made his stomach twist. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He turned, frowning. Who would be visiting him after all these years? When he opened the door, a woman stood before him, her hazel eyes filled with something between relief and curiosity. "David Carter?" she asked. He narrowed his eyes, trying to place her. "Yeah, who's asking?" She smiled, though it was tinged with hesitation. "I'm Rebecca. I volunteer at the church. Pastor James told me you were back in town." David crossed his arms. "And?" Rebecca shifted slightly, undeterred by his cold demeanor. "And he thought you might need a friend." David let out a humorless chuckle. "Is that right?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Look, I don't know your story, but I do know what it's like to feel lost, to think that maybe God's turned his back on you." David stiffened. "And what? You found your way back?" Rebecca nodded. "Not on my own, but I had people who reminded me that God hadn't left, even when I thought he had." Something about her words unsettled him. "I don't need saving," he muttered. Rebecca's gaze softened. "No one said you did." She took a step back. "But if you ever want to talk about faith, about Emily, or about why you're really here, I'm around." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David standing in the doorway, her words pressing against the fragile walls he had spent years building. For the second time that night, something shifted inside him. He wasn't sure if it was comfort or discomfort. All he knew was that, despite himself, he wasn't as alone as he thought. David barely slept that night. He sat in the dim glow of the old lamp, staring at Emily's picture on the mantel, lost in thoughts he wished he could silence. The weight of the past pressed down on him like an iron chain, memories of a time when faith had been second nature, when God had felt close. But now, God felt like a stranger. By morning, he decided he needed to get out of the house. Staying there, surrounded by echoes of what once was, only made it harder to breathe. The town hadn't changed much. The same corner store where he and Emily used to buy candy, the same small park where they'd played as kids, the same quiet streets that had once felt too small for his ambitions. David had just turned onto Main Street when he spotted her, Rebecca. She was outside the church, arranging a box of donated supplies near the entrance. A part of him considered turning the other way, but before he could move, she looked up. She smiled. "Morning," she called. David hesitated, then sighed, stuffing his hands into his pockets as he made his way over. "You always hang around here?" Rebecca chuckled. "It's a church, kind of what we do." She gestured toward the supplies. We're collecting donations for a shelter on the outskirts of town. Pastor James likes to remind us that faith isn't just words, it's action. David nodded slowly, shifting on his feet. He remembered Emily saying something similar, once. Rebecca studied him for a moment before speaking again. You don't have to stay, but if you're looking for something to do, I wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands. David almost declined, almost walked away, but something, curiosity, guilt, or maybe just the need for a distraction, kept him there. Fine, he muttered. What do you need? Rebecca grinned. Come on, Carter. Let's see if you're any good at sorting canned goods. David rolled his eyes, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, something that almost felt like purpose. David spent the next hour stacking canned goods into neat rows, sorting through donations of blankets and clothes. It was mindless work, and maybe that's why he didn't hate it. It kept his hands busy, gave his mind something to focus on besides the aching hollowness in his chest. Rebecca worked alongside him, humming softly to herself. Every now and then, she'd steal a glance at him, as if she was trying to figure him out. Finally, she broke the silence. So, how long are you in town? David didn't look up. Haven't decided. You thinking about staying? He scoffed. Doubted. Rebecca nodded, but there was something knowing in her expression. You know, Pastor James still prays for you. David stiffened. Why? Because that's what he does. She placed a stack of folded blankets into a bin. He prays for all of us, especially the ones who try to run from grace. David swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He changed the subject. You've been at this church long? Rebecca smiled. Most of my life. It's home. Home. The word sat heavy in David's chest. This town had been his home once. The church had been his home once. But now? Now, he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere. Before he could say anything, the front doors creaked open. David turned, expecting to see Pastor James. Instead, a man stepped inside. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, his eyes weary yet piercing. The same homeless man from the diner. David tensed. The man looked right at him and smiled faintly. Nice to see you again. Rebecca brightened. Daniel, you made it. David's stomach turned. Rebecca knew this guy? She turned to David. Daniel stops by sometimes when we have extra supplies. He's got a story, just like the rest of us. Daniel chuckled. Don't we all? His gaze lingered on David. Some of us just take longer to find our way back. David felt his jaw clench. He wasn't lost. Was he? David crossed his arms as Daniel stepped farther into the room, his presence unsettling. Something about the man, his words, his knowing gaze, made David uneasy. Rebecca, on the other hand, greeted him warmly, pulling out a chair. Have a seat, Daniel. I'll get you something to eat. Daniel nodded in thanks and sat down, his eyes never straying far from David. David hesitated. He wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't here to fix anything. He just needed time to figure things out, or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. But something about Daniel's presence nagged at him. You're the guy from the diner, David finally said. Daniel smirked. Guilty as charged. You were watching me. Daniel shrugged. I was noticing you. Big difference. David narrowed his eyes. Noticing me? Why? Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Because I know a lost soul when I see one. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy. David forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. You don't know anything about me. Daniel tilted his head. Don't I? Rebecca returned, setting down a plate of warm food in front of Daniel. "Here you go." She glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" Daniel gave a small nod, but his gaze never left David. "Just talking." David scoffed. "More like making assumptions." Daniel picked up his fork but didn't eat. Instead, he spoke, softly, yet with a quiet authority. "You used to believe, didn't you?" David stiffened. "What?" "You had faith once," Daniel continued, studying him. "But something happened. Something broke you." Rebecca's eyes flickered with concern. "Daniel, it's fine," David cut in, but his voice was tight. He met Daniel's gaze head on. "You think you know me?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I know grief when I see it." A lump formed in David's throat. Daniel set his fork down and leaned back in his chair. "You can run from a lot of things, David, but you can't outrun the truth." David felt the weight of those words settle on his chest, suffocating and inescapable. Because deep down, he knew Daniel was right. David stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the worn wooden floor. His heart pounded as Daniel's words echoed in his mind. "You can run from a lot of things, David, but you can't outrun the truth." "I don't know who you think you are," David muttered, his voice sharp. "But you don't get to dig into my past like that." Daniel remained seated, his expression unreadable. "I'm not digging. I'm just calling it like I see it." David clenched his jaw, fists tightening at his sides. "You don't see anything." Rebecca, sensing the tension rising, stepped forward. "David," he turned on her, his frustration spilling over. "What? You're okay with this?" He gestured toward Daniel. "With him acting like he knows me?" Rebecca hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think he's just trying to help." David let out a bitter laugh. "Help? I don't need help. I'm doing just fine." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "No, you're not." David's glare sharpened. "Excuse me?" Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "You walk around like a man carrying the weight of a world that was never meant to be yours. You push people away because you think if you let them in, they'll see how broken you are." He leaned forward slightly. "And most of all, you're angry. Not just in life, not just at God, but to yourself." David's breath caught in his throat. Daniel's voice softened. "Tell me I'm wrong." David swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He wanted to argue, to deny it, to walk away, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Rebecca placed a gentle hand on his arm. "David, no one is here to hurt you." He exhaled sharply, yanking his arm away. "I can't do this." His voice was barely above a whisper. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, the weight of his past pressing heavier than ever. David's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he walked aimlessly through the town, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The cool night air did little to calm the fire raging inside him. "You're angry, not just in life, not just at God, but to yourself." Daniel's words wouldn't leave him. They gnawed at his soul, unraveling defenses he had spent years fortifying. He stopped in front of an old storefront, its faded sign barely readable in the dim light. A cafe, one he and Emily used to visit when they were kids. He could almost hear her laughter, see her sitting across from him, swinging her legs beneath the chair as she dipped a sugar cookie into her milk. A sharp ache gripped his chest. His fists clenched. How dare Daniel act like he understood? Like he could peer into David's soul and see the torment he kept buried? He turned away from the cafe and kept walking. Minutes later, he found himself standing outside the church, his childhood church. the place where he once believed in something greater. The place where he and Emily had sat side by side, whispering, during sermons until their mother gave them a sharp look. The place where he had prayed, begged, for God to save her. And God hadn't. His breathing grew unsteady. The church doors were locked, but even standing there felt suffocating. He wanted to leave, to push the memories away, but his feet refused to move. A quiet voice broke the silence. "I had a feeling you'd come here." David turned sharply. Rebecca stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. He let out a breath, forcing his voice to stay even. "Were you following me?" She shook her head. "No, just a guess." She glanced at the church. "It means something to you, doesn't it?" David swallowed, his jaw tightening. "It used to." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "You don't have to keep running, David." He scoffed. "I'm not running." Rebecca tilted her head. "Then why are you always looking for a way out?" His throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Rebecca took a step closer. "You don't have to do this alone." David's eyes dropped to the ground. A long silence stretched between them before he finally whispered, "I don't know how to stop." Rebecca's voice was gentle. "Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once. Maybe you just take the first step." David hesitated, staring at the church doors. The first step. But was he ready to take it? David stood frozen before the church doors, Rebecca's words lingering in the crisp night air. "Maybe you just take the first step." His fingers twitched at his sides. How many times had he thought about stepping back into that church? How many times had he stopped himself at the last moment, convincing himself that faith had failed him? He exhaled sharply. "And what if I don't know what that first step is?" Rebecca offered a small, knowing smile. "Then let someone walk with you." David glanced at her, uncertainty clouding his expression. He barely knew her. Why? Did she care so much? A moment passed before she gestured toward the wooden bench beneath the church's street lamp. "Let's sit." David hesitated before reluctantly following. The bench was old, its paint chipped from years of exposure, but it felt familiar, like something unchanged in a world that had shifted beneath him. Rebecca waited for a moment before speaking. "I know you don't want to talk about it, but I also know it's weighing on you. Your sister." David's stomach clenched. His fingers curled into fists, then relaxed. He sighed. "Emily was everything good in my life." Rebecca remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "She was always the one with faith," he murmured. "Even when she got sick. Especially then." His voice wavered, but he pushed through. "She used to say that no matter what happened, she wasn't afraid. That God had a plan." A bitter chuckle escaped him. "I couldn't understand how she believed that while she was suffering." Rebecca's gaze softened. "And you still don't?" David looked away. How could I? A gentle breeze passed between them, rustling the leaves overhead. "Loss is hard," Rebecca said after a while. "And anger is even harder. But shutting God out doesn't make the pain go away." David's throat tightened. "It's easier than feeling disappointed again." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I get that." David frowned. "Do you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I lost my father when I was 15. Car accident." Her voice softened. "He was the one who always brought me to church, read the Bible with me, prayed with me before bed. And then one night, he was gone." David swallowed hard. "I was angry too," she admitted. I didn't understand why God would take him from me. I walked away from church, from faith, from everything. I thought if I just ignored it, the pain would stop. She exhaled. But it didn't. David studied her, his walls beginning to crack just a little. So what changed? Rebecca smiled faintly. I realized God hadn't left me. I had left him, and I was the one who needed to turn back. David's chest tightened. Turn back. Was that what he was doing here? Standing outside the church, fighting the war inside himself? Rebecca's voice was gentle. You don't have to have all the answers tonight, David, but you can choose to stop running. David looked at the church doors once more. His past, his doubts, his pain. They all sat on the other side. But maybe, just maybe, so did his redemption. And maybe, it was time to take that first step. David stood at the edge of the church steps, staring at the heavy wooden doors as if they held the answer to everything. His heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the war inside him. One step. Just one. Rebecca remained beside him, silent but steady, her presence a quiet encouragement. He clenched his fists. The last time he had entered this church was the day of Emily's funeral. The memories clawed at him, soft whispers, sorrowful hymns, the hollow echo of his footsteps as he walked away, convinced he was done with faith, forever. But forever felt different now. He exhaled sharply. I don't know if I can do this. Rebecca didn't push. Then don't do it alone. David hesitated, then reached for the door handle. The wood was smooth beneath his palm, familiar, yet foreign. He turned it slowly, and the door creaked open. Warm light spilled onto the church steps. Inside, the sanctuary was dimly lit, the flickering glow of candles near the altar casting shadows along the wooden pews. The scent of aged hymnals and old wood filled the air. It was quiet, save for the faint sound of a piano playing in the background. Soft, almost like a whisper of invitation. David's breath hitched. Everything looked the same. And yet, he felt like a stranger in a place that had once been home. Rebecca stepped in first, offering him the space to decide. After a long pause, David forced himself inside. His footsteps echoed against the stone floor, each step an unfamiliar weight. He glanced toward the pulpit. It was empty, but the presence of someone lingered. Pastor James appeared from a side door, his movement slow but sure. The elderly preacher froze the moment he saw David, his weathered face unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Pastor James smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that carried no judgment, only warmth. David Carter, he said softly, as if the name was a prayer. Welcome home. David swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wasn't sure if this place still felt like home, but for the first time in years, he wasn't walking away. David stood frozen, his mind tangled between relief and resistance. Pastor James had aged, but his eyes still held the same depth of wisdom that had once anchored David's wavering faith. Rebecca gave David a gentle nod before slipping into a pew near the back, giving him space. Pastor James stepped forward, his movements slow but sure. It's been a long time, son. David swallowed. Yeah. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The air inside the church felt heavier than it had moments ago, as if the weight of David's past choices had gathered in this place, waiting for acknowledgement. Pastor James gestured toward a pew. Will you sit with me? David hesitated. He had avoided this moment for years, returning, facing the man who had once been his spiritual mentor. But something inside nudged him forward. He sighed and followed the pastor, sliding onto the wooden bench. The older man studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I won't ask why you stayed away. I imagine you already know." David let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was angry, Pastor. Still am, maybe." Pastor James nodded. "That's honest." David clenched his fists. Emily believed so much. She never doubted, not once. But God still took her. His voice cracked, raw and unfiltered. And I couldn't accept that. I still don't know if I can. Pastor James remained quiet for a moment before sighing. Loss does that. It breaks us. It makes us question everything we thought we knew. His eyes softened. Even Jesus wept at death, David. He never asked us not to grieve. David shook his head. Then why does it feel like I'm betraying her by being here? The pastor leaned back, looking toward the altar. Because guilt is a cruel thing. It tricks us into believing that love must come with punishment. He turned back to David. But your sister would never have wanted that for you. David exhaled sharply. I don't know if I can find my way back. Pastor James smiled gently. No one finds their way back alone. That's why grace exists. The words settled deep in David's chest, stirring something he wasn't ready to name. For now, he didn't have answers. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from the questions. David sat in silence, staring at his hands as if they held the answers he had spent years searching for. Pastor James's words echoed in his mind. No one finds their way back alone. That's why grace exists. But grace had always felt distant, something meant for others, not for him. Pastor James sighed, breaking the stillness. Tell me, David, what do you believe grace is? David scoffed. A second chance? A clean slate? I don't know. I guess I never really thought about it. The pastor nodded thoughtfully. Most people don't. But grace isn't just a second chance. It's an undeserved gift. It's God meeting us where we are, even when we think we don't deserve it. David leaned back against the pew, rubbing his hands together. I don't know if I can accept that. I walked away from all of this, from God. Why would he still care? Pastor James smiled, his eyes filled with patience. David, do you remember the parable of the prodigal son? David hesitated before nodding. Yeah. The son took his inheritance, left home, wasted everything, and ended up broke. When he came back, his father welcomed him with open arms. Pastor James leaned forward slightly. And tell me, when did the father's love for his son stop? David frowned. It never did. The pastor nodded. Exactly. The son may have left, but the father never stopped waiting for him. And when the son came home, filthy, broken, ashamed, the father didn't make him beg for forgiveness. He ran to him. The words struck David in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so long believing that turning back meant groveling, proving himself worthy before God would take him back. But if grace was what Pastor James said it was, then maybe God had been waiting for him all along. David exhaled shakily. I don't know if I can just flip a switch and believe again. Pastor James placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. No one said you had to. Faith isn't about flipping a switch. It's about taking the next step, even when you're unsure. David swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. For the first time in years, the idea of God didn't feel like an unreachable concept. It felt possible. But was he ready? As if sensing the war within him, Pastor James gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. You don't have to have it all figured out, David. Just don't walk away from the conversation. David nodded slowly. I'll think about it. And for now, that was enough. David stepped out of the church, the cool evening air wrapping around him like a quiet embrace. The weight of his conversation with Pastor James still clung to him. He had come looking for answers, but all he had found were more questions. As he made his way down the empty street, the city's distant hum echoing in the background, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out. A number he didn't recognize flashed across the screen. Something told him to answer. Hello? For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, soft, familiar. David? His breath caught. It had been years since he had heard that voice, but he would know it anywhere. Rebecca? She let out a small laugh, one filled with relief. You actually picked up. David ran a hand through his hair, uncertain. Yeah, it's been a long time. It has. There was a pause. Pastor James told me, you stopped by. David exhaled sharply. I should have known he'd tell you. Rebecca chuckled. You know him. He's been praying for you for years. We all have. David leaned against a street lamp, staring at the cracks in the sidewalk. Yeah, well, I'm still figuring things out. That's okay, she said gently. No one expects you to have it all together. David let the silence linger between them. There had been a time when Rebecca had been one of his closest friends, one of the few who had tried to keep him connected to faith after Emily's passing. But he had pushed her away, just like he had pushed everyone else. I'm not the same person I was, Rebecca. I know, she said. Neither am I. Something about her words made him pause. She wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't trying to convince him of anything. She was just there. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the presence of someone who knew the man he used to be. Can I ask you something? He said after a moment. Of course. David hesitated before finally voicing the question that had been gnawing at him. Do you really think God still cares about me? Rebecca's voice was soft but sure. I don't just think it, David. I know it. Her words hit him harder than he expected. After a beat, she added, Why don't you come by the church this Sunday? No pressure, no expectations. Just come. David let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. But something about the way she asked, about the way her voice carried no judgment, only sincerity, made it harder to say no. I'll think about it, he said. Rebecca smiled through the phone. That's all I ask. As the call ended, David stood in the quiet of the night, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressing down on him. But for the first time in years, there was a small flicker of something else. Hope. David sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the wall as morning sunlight crept through the blinds. The echoes of last night's conversation with Rebecca still played in his mind. Why don't you come by the church this Sunday? He had said he'd think about it, but deep down, he already knew what he wanted to say. No. Not because he didn't believe, at least not entirely. But because stepping into that church again meant stepping into a past he had spent years running from. It meant facing the grief he had buried, the people he had abandoned, and the God he had turned his back on. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. David frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He pulled on a hoodie and walked toward the door, opening it slowly. There, standing with a small paper bag in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, was the mysterious stranger, the same man he had encountered outside the mission weeks ago. David blinked. You? The man smiled. Good to see you again, David. David stiffened. How do you know my name? The man chuckled. You talk in your sleep. David frowned. Excuse me. The man held up his hand. Relax. Kid, I was at the shelter last night. You were there too, remember? David's eyes narrowed. He had been there, after wandering the streets for hours, lost in thought. He had barely spoken to anyone before crashing on one of the empty cots. And you just decided to show up at my apartment? The man shrugged, handing him the coffee. Consider it a divine appointment. David hesitated before taking the cup, his suspicion not entirely fading. Who are you? The man smiled but didn't answer directly. I was just passing, through and thought you might need some breakfast. You've got the look of someone at war with himself. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You have no idea. Maybe I do. The man sat on the steps outside David's door, motioning for him to do the same. Want to talk about it? David considered slamming the door and going back to bed. Instead, he sighed and sat down beside him. It's church, David admitted reluctantly. Someone invited me to go, but I don't think I can. The man nodded as if he already knew. Because it reminds you of everything you've lost. David clenched his jaw. Yeah. The man was quiet, for a moment before speaking. You know, I used to avoid church too. David glanced at him. Why? The man smiled faintly. Because I thought I wasn't worthy of being there. David scoffed. I think that's different. Is it? The man turned to look at him. You feel like an outsider, like you've been away too long, made too many mistakes. Like walking into that church would be an admission of something you're not ready to face. David said nothing. The man continued. But what if I told you the church isn't for the perfect? What if I told you it's for people like you and me, the broken, the lost, the ones who need grace the most? David let out a bitter laugh. Grace, huh? I don't know if there's any left for me. The man placed a firm hand on David's shoulder. There's more than enough. For a long moment, David just stared at the ground. He wanted to believe that. He really did. The man stood, dusting off his coat. You don't have to have all the answers today. Just take a step. David looked up at him. And what step is that? The man smiled. Show up. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. David sat there for a long time, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Show up. Could he? Would he? He didn't have an answer. But for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he would say no. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet stillness. David sat in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His mind was restless, battling itself over whether he should actually go to church. He had told himself that showing up wasn't a commitment, just a step. And yet, his heart pounded as if he were walking toward a battle. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Rebecca. Hope to see you at church today. No pressure, just know you're welcome. David exhaled, gripping the edges of the sink. Maybe she meant that. Maybe she and the others at that church wouldn't look at him with judgment. But would God? His fingers traced the silver cross necklace tucked beneath his shirt, the last thing of Emily's he still carried. He stood up. Before he could change his mind, he grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. The small church sat on the corner of an old street, its steeple standing against the morning sky. It looked exactly as he remembered it. The white, paint slightly faded, the stained glass windows reflecting the sun's light. David parked a few blocks away and stared at the entrance from a distance. People trickled inside, exchanging greetings and warm smiles. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. This was a mistake. He wasn't ready. His fingers hovered over the ignition, about to start the car and drive away, when a knock on the passenger window startled him. David turned and saw Pastor James standing outside, his kind eyes watching him with a knowing look. David hesitated before rolling down the window. "Morning, son," the pastor greeted. "Good to see you." David forced a small, uneasy smile. "Morning." Pastor James glanced toward the church. "Planning on coming in?" David hesitated. "I don't know." The pastor nodded as if he understood. "I remember the last time you were here. Emily had just passed." David's throat tightened. "Yeah." Pastor James rested a hand on the car door. "I won't pretend to know your pain, David. But I do know this. God hasn't turned his back on you." David looked away. "Maybe I turned my back on him first. And yet, here you are," the pastor said gently. David swallowed hard. Pastor James smiled. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't even have to stay long. Just come inside. Sit in the back if you want. Listen." David exhaled. He could still leave, but something in him, something beyond his grief and doubt, wanted to step out of the car. Finally, he pushed. The door open. Pastor James patted his shoulder. "No pressure. Just welcome." David followed him toward the church doors, each step heavier than the last. But for the first time in years, he was walking toward God instead of running away. The church doors creaked softly as David stepped inside. The scent of aged wood and faint candle wax filled the air, carrying with it a flood of memories, ones he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He lingered near the entrance as the congregation stood, their voices lifting in song. David's eyes scanned the room. It was familiar yet distant, like looking at a photograph from a past life. Families stood together, some with hands raised, others with closed eyes, lost in worship. He swallowed. What was he doing here? Slipping into the last row, David sat stiffly, his hands clasped together. The music was beautiful, yet he couldn't bring himself to sing. How could he praise a God who had let Emily die? From the pulpit, Pastor James stepped forward as the music faded. "Good morning, church," he greeted. "It's good to be in the house of the Lord today." A chorus of amens echoed in response. The pastor's eyes swept across the room. "This morning, God laid a message on my heart about the prodigal son." David tensed. The story of the prodigal son. A tale of a man who took his inheritance, abandoned his home, and squandered everything, only to return, ashamed and broken, to a father who embraced him with open arms. David shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Was this a coincidence, or had Pastor James known he'd be here? Pastor James continued, his voice steady. "Many of us know this story. A young man leaves his father's house thinking he can make it on his own. He turns his back on everything good, and when he finds himself at his lowest, he wonders if he could ever return." The words pierced through David. "But the most powerful part of this story," the pastor went on, "isn't the son's failure, it's the father's reaction." The congregation listened intently. The father doesn't wait for his son to crawl home in shame. He doesn't demand explanations or repayment. He runs to him. David's breathing slowed. He throws his arms around his broken child and calls for a feast, because what was lost has now been found. David gritted his teeth. That father didn't sound like God. Not the God he remembered. Not the God who let Emily suffer. Not the God who had been silent through all of David's pain. The pastor's voice softened. "Some of you may feel like that prodigal son today. Maybe you've run so far that you don't believe you can ever come back." David exhaled sharply. "This isn't for me." But as he shifted in his seat, something inside him wrestled against the wall he had built. Pastor James's next words cut through every excuse. "You may have turned your back on God, but he never turned his back on you." The weight in David's chest grew heavier. For the first time since Emily's death, a lump formed in his throat, not from anger, but from something deeper, something dangerously close to hope. The pastor closed his Bible. If you're lost, the Father is waiting. The question is, will you take the first step home? David clenched his fists. Was he ready for that step? David sat frozen in the pew. The words of Pastor James still echoed in his mind. You may have turned your back on God, but he never turned his back on you. His fingers curled into fists. Why did those words bother him so much? The congregation began to move, some heading toward the altar for prayer, others filing out to greet one another. David remained seated, staring at the worn-out hymnal in front of him, his heartbeat loud in his ears. A soft voice broke through his thoughts. You came. David looked up to find Rebecca standing near the end of the pew, a gentle smile on her face. For a moment, he considered brushing past her and leaving, but something in her kind expression made him hesitate. Yeah, he muttered. I don't know why. Rebecca sat down beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. You don't have to know why, she said. You're here. That's enough for now. David exhaled through his nose. I don't even know if I believe in any of this anymore. Rebecca nodded, unshaken. That's okay. His brow furrowed. Is it? She turned to face him. David, doubt doesn't scare God. He's big enough for your anger, your questions, even your silence. He swallowed. Hard, his eyes darting toward the altar where a few people knelt in prayer. I don't know how to just come back, he admitted. It's been too long. Too much has happened. Rebecca's voice softened. You don't have to have it all figured out. God isn't asking you to fix yourself before you come to him. David let out a dry chuckle. You sound like Pastor James. She smiled. Well, I've been listening to him for a while. Silence settled between them. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Rebecca said, Do you want to talk to him? Pastor James, I mean. David hesitated. Part of him wanted to run. The other part, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge, wanted answers. I don't know, he murmured. Rebecca didn't press. She simply placed a hand on the pew beside her. You don't have to decide right now, but if you ever do, he's here. David nodded, though he wasn't sure he meant it. Rebecca stood. I'll let you be, but for what it's worth, David, I'm glad you came today. And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. David sat there for a long time. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier. But something about the sermon, about Rebecca's words, about simply being here, it stirred something deep inside him. Something he wasn't ready to name. Yet for the first time in years, he wasn't as certain about walking away. David sat in the church long after most of the congregation had left. The stained glass windows cast shifting colors across the wooden pews as the late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his hands together, debating whether to leave or stay. Then, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. You always were the last to leave. David turned to see Pastor James standing a few feet away, his old Bible tucked beneath one arm. The elderly preacher's eyes were kind, yet sharp, as if he saw straight through David's defenses. David let out a dry chuckle. I don't know if that's true anymore. Pastor James didn't move closer, giving David space. Rebecca said you might want to talk. David sighed, shaking his head. I wouldn't go that far. A knowing smile touched the pastor's lips. Then let's just sit. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the distant hum of conversation from the church lobby the only sound between them. Finally, Pastor James spoke. "You look like a man carrying a heavy burden." David scoffed. "That's one way to put it. Would you tell me about it?" David hesitated. Something in the pastor's voice, calm, unwavering, patient, made it hard to brush him off. After a moment, he let out a breath. "I don't think God cares about people like me." Pastor James didn't flinch. "And why is that?" David stared at the floor. His throat tightened. "Because I walked away." His voice dropped lower. "Because I blamed him for everything." Pastor James nodded as if he had heard this before. "You think you're the first to feel that way?" David clenched his jaw. "I don't know." "David," the pastor said gently, "have you ever read about Peter?" David frowned. "Of course I have. I used to read the Bible all the time." His voice carried an edge of bitterness. Pastor James didn't react to the sharpness. "Then you know Peter was one of Jesus' closest followers. He saw miracles. He walked on water. But when things got hard, when fear crept in, he denied Jesus 3 times. David stiffened. The pastor continued, his voice steady. But Jesus didn't cast Peter aside. He restored him, called him to something greater. David let the words settle, staring at the wooden floor beneath his feet. "You think God has turned his back on you because you walked away," Pastor James said, his voice quieter now. "But what if he's been waiting for you to come back this whole time?" David swallowed, the weight in his chest pressing harder. "I don't know how to come back," he admitted. Pastor James smiled. "You already have." David's head shot up, his eyes searching the old preacher's face. "Coming back doesn't start with having all the answers," Pastor James continued. "It starts with a step, even a small one." David's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Pastor James stood, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "When you're ready, he's ready." And with that, the pastor walked toward his office, leaving David alone once again. But this time, the silence didn't feel so empty. This time, there was something else there, something that felt a lot like hope. David left the church, his mind heavy with Pastor James's words. The sun had almost set, casting the town in golden hues. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth after a recent rain. He walked without thinking, his feet leading him through familiar streets, past the diner where he and Emily used to get milkshakes, past the park where they'd spent countless afternoons, past the corner where he last saw her before everything fell apart. Each step unearthed another memory, another piece of the past he had tried so hard to bury. Before he knew it, he was standing in front of an old white house, his childhood home. The porch light flickered, a dim glow against the darkening sky. It had been years since he had stepped foot inside. But tonight, something pulled him back. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. Stepping inside, the scent of aged wood and faint vanilla, his mother's favorite, candle washed over him. The house was still, almost frozen in time. His parents had moved years ago, but they hadn't sold the place. His eyes landed on the staircase. At the top was Emily's old room. David inhaled sharply. He hadn't been in that room since the funeral. His body moved before his mind could stop it, taking slow steps up the stairs. The old wood creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing in the silence. When he reached her door, his hand hesitated on the knob. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room was untouched. Her bed was still covered in the same lavender quilt. Books were stacked neatly on the nightstand. A framed picture of the two of them sat beside it, Emily laughing, her arm draped over his shoulder. David swallowed hard. His gaze fell to the open Bible on her desk. It was worn, the pages dog-eared and covered in tiny notes written in the margins. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing over the familiar leather cover. Then, his eyes landed on a verse Emily had underlined, Isaiah 41:10. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." A lump formed in his throat. How many times had she tried to tell him that? How many times had she reminded him that God had never left? Tears burned in his eyes as he sank into the old wooden chair, gripping the Bible in his hands. "God, I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't even know if you hear me anymore." The room remained silent, but for the first time in years, David didn't feel alone. David sat in Emily's chair, gripping her Bible as if it were the last thread tethering him to sanity. The weight of the past pressed against his chest, suffocating, relentless. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a small clock on the nightstand. Time hadn't stopped, but it felt like it had here. Then, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. David stiffened, his breath hitching. The house was supposed to be empty. He turned slowly, his pulse quickening. "Hello?" His voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. He stood, the old wooden floor groaning under his weight. Carefully, he stepped toward the doorway, his hand steadying against the frame. The hallway was dim, shadows stretching long against the walls. Then he saw it. A figure stood near the staircase. David's breath caught. For a split second, his mind played a cruel trick on him. He thought it was Emily. The shape, the way the light caught the figure's outline, it was almost identical. But then the figure turned slightly, and David exhaled. It was the mysterious stranger. The same homeless man from the church steps, the one who had spoken words David couldn't shake. What are you doing here?" David asked, his voice hoarse. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at David with an expression both knowing and gentle, as if he had been expecting him. "Needed somewhere quiet to think?" the man finally said. David frowned. "How did you—" The man took a slow step forward. "God doesn't just move in loud places, son. Sometimes he speaks in whispers." David swallowed hard. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to demand answers. But deep down, a part of him knew this wasn't just a coincidence. "Why are you here?" David asked again, quieter this time. The man smiled faintly. "Same reason you are." He gestured toward the Bible in David's hands. "Looking for something I thought I lost." David glanced down at the book, then back up. "And did you find it?" The man chuckled. "Not all at once. But God is patient, even when we aren't." David's fingers tightened around the Bible. For years, he had run from his faith, from his past, from God. But somehow, tonight, sitting in his sister's room, standing face to face with this stranger who seemed to know more than he should, he wasn't sure he could run anymore. A deep, tired sigh escaped his lips. "What if I don't know how to come back?" The man's eyes softened. "You don't have to. You just have to turn around." David exhaled, the words sinking in. For the first time in years, he wondered, was God still waiting for him? Was it really that simple? The stranger gave him a small nod, then turned toward the stairs. "I think you have some praying to do." David watched him go, his heart pounding. When he finally blinked, the man was gone. The house was silent once more. David looked back at Emily's Bible. Then slowly, he dropped to his knees. David knelt on the worn carpet of Emily's room, the Bible open before him. His fingers trembled as he traced the underlined verses in her handwriting. Romans 8:38-39, a passage she had always clung to. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. His breath hitched. He had spent years running, believing his grief had severed him from God. And yet, Emily had believed, no, she had known, that nothing could separate them from him. David swallowed hard. Could that still be true? He shut his eyes. God, if you're still there, I don't know how to do this. His voice was barely a whisper. Silence. His hands clenched into fists, the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to believe again, but his heart was raw, uncertain. He exhaled sharply. I don't deserve grace. I walked away. I gave up. And now I'm supposed to just come back? His voice cracked. The weight of his guilt was suffocating. Then, in the quiet, a thought surfaced. A memory. Pastor James's voice from years ago, teaching in Sunday school. God's love isn't earned, David. It's given. You don't have to be worthy of it. You just have to accept it. David's eyes snapped open. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at the open Bible. Emily had believed it. Pastor James had believed it. That homeless man, whoever he was, believed it. Could he? The words formed on his lips again. But before he could finish, a knock at the front door startled him. David wiped at his face, rising from the floor. Who could be visiting this late? With a deep breath, he walked out of Emily's room and toward the door. The weight in his chest hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. Something was stirring, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. David hesitated at the door, his heartbeat quickening. The knock came again, firm, yet patient. Taking a breath, he unlocked it and pulled it open. A cold breeze swept in, carrying the scent of rain-soaked pavement. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp, was Pastor James. His old, weary eyes studied David carefully, his face a mix of relief and quiet understanding. He held a Bible in one hand, its worn leather cover familiar. David, the pastor said gently. David swallowed, gripping the doorframe. Pastor, what are you doing here? Pastor James offered a small smile. I had a feeling you might need a friend tonight. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure what to say. The pastor continued, his voice steady. I ran into Rebecca earlier today. She mentioned she saw you at the church, sitting in the back. David tensed, so someone had noticed. I wasn't really there, David muttered, glancing away. I was just passing through. Pastor James chuckled softly. Son, when God draws you somewhere, it's never just passing through. David let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. I don't know what I'm doing, Pastor. That's okay, Pastor James said. But you're here, and that means something. A long silence settled between them. The weight of the moment pressed on David's chest. Finally, Pastor James spoke again. Would you let an old man come in for a cup of coffee? David hesitated, then slowly stepped aside. Yeah, come in. As the pastor stepped inside, David shut the door behind him. Something about this felt different. For the first time, in years, he didn't feel so alone. The soft hum of the coffee maker filled the quiet apartment. David stood at the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the dark liquid swirling inside. Across from him, Pastor James sat at the small kitchen table, his Bible resting beside him. For a while, Neither of them spoke. David finally broke the silence. "I don't even know why I let you in." Pastor James chuckled. "Maybe because you're tired of running." David clenched his jaw but said nothing. The pastor took a slow sip of his coffee, then leaned forward. "David, I've been praying for you. Ever since you walked away." David let out a dry laugh. "Well, I appreciate the effort, Pastor, but I don't think prayer changes anything." A flicker of sadness crossed Pastor James' face, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his Bible and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. David hesitated before picking it up. As he unfolded it, he immediately recognized the handwriting. His sister Emily's. His breath caught in his throat. "I found this in her old Bible," Pastor James said softly. "She left it there, and I think she meant for you to find it one day." David's hands trembled as he read the first line. "David, if you're reading this, it means God still hasn't let you go." His vision blurred as he read the rest. Emily had written about her faith in God's goodness, even in her sickness. How she believed David would find his way back to the truth one day. No matter how far you run, God will always be waiting for you. David clenched his fist around the note. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, voice shaking. Pastor James's voice was gentle but firm. "None of us do. That's the beauty of grace." David shook his head, emotions crashing over him. "You don't understand. I blamed God. I cursed him. I still don't know if I even believe anymore." Pastor James leaned back, watching him. "David, do you think God is afraid of your doubt?" David looked up, surprised. The pastor continued. "Look at Thomas. He doubted. He questioned. And yet, Jesus still met him where he was." He paused, then added, "God's not looking for perfect faith, David. He's looking for an honest heart." David swallowed hard, staring at the note again. For the first time in years, something inside him cracked. And for the first time in years, he wanted to believe. David sat on the edge of his bed, the letter from Emily still clutched in his hands. The words blurred as he read them over and over again, his mind fighting against the emotions welling up inside him. No matter how far you run, God will always be waiting for you. How could she have been so sure? How could she have believed so strongly, even in the face of death? A knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Rebecca standing in the doorway. Pastor James asked me to check on you," she said hesitantly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might need this." David sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Does he have you spying on me now?" Rebecca smirked. "More like checking if you're still breathing." She handed him a cup and sat down in the chair across from him. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she nodded toward the letter. "What's that?" David hesitated, then handed it to her. Rebecca unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. When she looked up, her gaze was full of emotion. "Wow," she whispered. "She really believed in you." David let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, more than I ever believed in myself." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice soft. "David, this letter, it's not just a message from Emily. It's a reminder of God's love. She never doubted that he was still pursuing you." David exhaled sharply. "You sound just like Pastor James." Rebecca grinned. "Well, he's usually right about these things." David stared at the cup in his hands. "I don't know if I can do this, Rebecca. I don't know if I can just walk back into faith like nothing happened." Rebecca's smile softened. "No one's asking you to pretend nothing happened. But maybe," she hesitated, then continued. Maybe the first step isn't about having it all figured out. Maybe it's just about being willing to listen. David didn't respond, but her words settled deep inside him. After a moment, she stood. There's a Bible study at the church tomorrow night. No pressure, but if you're looking for a place to start, you're always welcome. David let out a small scoff. Bible study? That's a pretty big step. Rebecca smirked. Then start with something smaller. She pointed to the nightstand. That Bible's been sitting there collecting dust for years. Maybe just open it. She turned to leave but paused at the door. You don't have to have all the answers, David. Just take a step. And with that, she was gone. David stared at the door for a long time. Then slowly, he reached for the worn Bible on his nightstand. He traced his fingers over the cover, heart pounding. And for the first time in years, he opened it. David's fingers hovered over the fragile pages of the Bible, the thin paper rustling beneath his hesitant touch. He hadn't opened this book in years, hadn't dared to. It had once been a source of comfort, a wellspring of faith. But after Emily's death, it had become a symbol of everything he had lost. Yet something in Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. Just take a step. Swallowing hard, he let the Bible fall open naturally, his eyes landing on a passage in the Gospel of Luke. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Luke 15:4, ESV. David's breath caught. The lost sheep. His hands clenched the edges of the Bible as memories surfaced. Emily had loved this passage. She had read it to him when he was a child, tucking him into bed, assuring him that no matter what, God never stopped searching for his lost ones. His throat tightened. He had spent years running, convinced that he was too broken, too far gone. But what if God had never stopped searching for him? A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. He set the Bible down and stood, up, expecting Rebecca again. Instead, when he opened the door, Pastor James stood before him, a kind smile on his weathered face. "Evening, son," the older man greeted. David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Rebecca sent you, didn't..." "She?" Pastor James chuckled. "No, but I wouldn't put it past her. I just had a feeling I should stop by." He glanced at the open Bible on the nightstand and raised an eyebrow. "And it looks like I came at the right time." David folded his arms. "It's just a book, Pastor." Pastor James tilted his head. "Then why do you look like it? Just punched you in the gut?" David hesitated. His usual instinct was to deflect, to brush it off, but something in Pastor James' gentle gaze made him pause. I read something," David admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Luke 15. The lost sheep. Pastor James nodded knowingly. "Ah, a reminder that no one is too far gone for God to find." David let out a shaky breath. "You really believe that?" The old pastor stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Son, I don't just believe it. I've lived it. And if you're willing to listen, I think you're about to live it too." David swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but for the first time in years he wanted to be. And maybe that was enough. David sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, his fingers interlocked as if holding himself together. Across from him, Pastor James settled into the worn armchair near the window, his Bible resting on his lap. The quiet between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Pastor James finally broke the silence. "Tell me, David, what about that passage shook you?" David exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know." He paused, then shook his head. No, that's a lie. I do know. His voice was tight. It reminded me of Emily. The pastor nodded, listening. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She used to read that story to me when I was a kid. She said it was proof that God never gives up on us. His jaw clenched. But she still died. She still suffered. So what does that mean? Did God give up on her? Pastor James sighed deeply, his eyes filled with understanding. Son, I won't pretend to have easy answers. Grief is a hard road. But I do know this. Emily wasn't abandoned. He tapped his Bible gently. She may have left this world, but she was never lost to God. David swallowed. Then why couldn't he heal her? His voice cracked. Why did I have to lose the only person who believed in me? Pastor James leaned forward. David, have you ever thought that maybe Emily's faith wasn't just for her? That maybe it was for you too? David's brows furrowed. What do you mean? The pastor smiled faintly. Emily spent her life pointing you toward God. Even now, in your anger, in your grief, you're still being drawn back. He gestured toward the open Bible. And that's not by accident. David scoffed, shaking his head. You really think God is still chasing me? After everything I've done? Pastor James chuckled. I don't think, son. I know. David stared at him. The old pastor continued, Jesus didn't come for the ones who have it all together. He came for the broken, the doubters, the angry, the lost. And you, David Carter, are not beyond his reach. David's throat tightened. Pastor James leaned in slightly. The question isn't whether he's searching for you, David. The question is, are you going to let yourself be found? The room was silent. David's heart pounded in his chest. A battle waged inside him. His pain, his resistance, his longing. He wanted to believe. But could he? As the night deepened, Pastor James didn't press for an answer. Instead, he prayed silently, while David sat in the tension of a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running. And maybe that was the first step. David lay awake long after Pastor James left, staring at the ceiling of the small guest room. The dim glow from the streetlight outside cast long shadows across the walls. His mind replayed the pastor's words. But more than that, Emily's voice echoed in his heart. David, God isn't waiting for you to be perfect. He just wants you to come home. He squeezed his eyes shut. He had spent years running, drowning out that whisper with distractions, guilt, and anger. But now, in the quiet of this room, there was nothing left to drown it out. He turned on his side, his gaze falling on the worn Bible Pastor James had left on the nightstand. A part of him wanted to shove it aside. The other part, the one that ached with longing, hesitated. With a sigh, David reached for the book. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through its pages, landing on Luke 15:20. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. David's breath caught in his throat. He read the words again, and again. While he was still a long way off, tears burned in his eyes. The son hadn't even made it all the way home. The father had run to him. Was that what God was doing now? Running toward him, even after all he had done? A sob built in David's chest, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he closed the Bible, pressing it against his forehead for a long moment before setting it down. He exhaled shakily, turning toward the window, and for the first time in years he whispered a prayer. God, If you're really still here, please, show me." The wind outside stirred the trees. A stillness filled the room, one that wasn't empty, but full. And though David didn't have all the answers, for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir deep inside him. Hope. David woke up before the sun rose, an unusual stillness settling over him. The air in the small room felt different, not lighter, not yet, but different. His chest still carried the weight of his past, but for the first time, it wasn't crushing him. He sat up, rubbing his face, his fingers brushing against the Bible he had left open on the nightstand. Last night's verse echoed in his heart. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He still didn't know how to just walk back into faith. But maybe, just maybe, God had never truly left him. A soft knock on the door startled him. "David?" It was Pastor James. David cleared, his throat. "Yeah? Breakfast is ready, son. Take your time." David hesitated before answering, "I'll be right down." He stood, stretching, and caught a glimpse of himself in the small mirror above the dresser. His face looked tired, worn, yet something in his expression seemed softer. He shook his head and grabbed his jacket. Whatever today held, he was willing to face it. The smell of coffee and eggs greeted David as he stepped into the kitchen. Rebecca was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Pastor James sat at the table with his Bible open, sipping from a steaming mug. "Morning," Rebecca greeted, offering him a small smile. "Morning." He sat down hesitantly, feeling the weight of the past conversations still lingering in the air. But Rebecca and Pastor James carried on as if everything was normal, not forcing him into any deep conversations, just yet. As he took his first bite, something about the warmth of the food, the simplicity of the moment, made his heart ache. "David," Pastor James finally spoke, setting his cup down. "I know you're wrestling with a lot, but you don't have to do it alone." David swallowed, nodding slowly. "I know." Rebecca turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a towel. "There's a service at the church tonight, a small one. No pressure, but you should come." David tensed instinctively, his first thought being to refuse. Church, the place he had abandoned. The place that had felt like a prison after Emily's death. But then, the verse from last night came to him again. While he was still a long way off, maybe he didn't have to have it all figured out. Maybe just taking a step forward was enough. He took a slow breath, then looked up at them. "I'll think about it." And for now, that was enough. The evening air was crisp as David stood outside the church, his heart pounding. The building looked just as it had years ago, sturdy, welcoming, yet overwhelming. The stained glass, windows reflected the soft glow of the sanctuary lights, casting colors onto the steps where he hesitated. He hadn't set foot in this place since Emily's funeral. A part of him still wanted to turn back. But then, he heard it, singing. Soft, reverent voices carried through the night air, weaving a melody of hope. "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy, lost and ruined by the fall." His throat tightened. The words echoed too close to home. He took a deep breath. One step, then another. Rebecca was at the door, waiting. She didn't push, didn't pry, just gave him a small nod and stepped inside. David followed. The sanctuary was dimly lit, the wooden pews half filled with familiar faces, people he had known before everything fell apart. Some turned as he entered, their eyes widening slightly in recognition. David kept his head down, making his way to a seat near the back. Pastor James stood at the front, his voice steady and warm. "We welcome all tonight, no matter where you are in your walk. God meets us in our brokenness. His grace is not for the perfect. It is for the lost, the hurting, the ones who think they've strayed too far. David exhaled sharply. That's me. Pastor James continued, reading from Luke 15:20, the verse that had been haunting David for days. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. David clenched his fists. The words felt like a breaking dam inside him, a long way off, but still seen, still loved. His vision blurred, his chest tightened. Then, something inside him cracked. He stood. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked toward the altar, the same altar where he had once prayed as a child. And then, for the first time in years, he knelt. Tears spilled freely as he lowered his head, words tumbling out in a broken whisper. I don't know how to come back, God. I don't know how to fix this. His voice trembled. But if you still want me, I'm here. The sanctuary was silent, except for the soft weeping of a prodigal son finally surrendering. A gentle hand rested on his shoulder. Pastor James knelt beside him. He never stopped wanting you, son. David sobbed, his shoulders shaking. And in that moment, on his knees before God, redemption found him.